Welcome to the Abridged Presidential Histories with Kenny Ryan, episode 25A, an interview on how McKinley changed American political campaigns forever with Christopher Nichols. I'm excited to welcome Professor Christopher McKnight Nichols to the show today. Chris is the director of the Oregon State University Center for the Humanities and an expert on the Gilded Age, Progressive Era, World War I, and the 1918 flu pandemic. He has also written or edited numerous books, including A Companion to the Gilded Age and Progressive Era, and Promise in Peril, America at the Dawn of the Global Age. Today, we're going to talk about the man who led America into that global age, William McKinley, and how he modernized American political campaigns. Chris, thank you so much for your time.
Kenny, thanks for having me on. And just at the outset, I want to say I really love your podcast. I think it's great how you choose sort of pithy examples that are fun from history that also smuggle in some great, important historical insights. So thanks.
I really appreciate that. That's so kind of you. My first question I got to ask of you is, what inspired your interest in Mr. William McKinley?
Yeah, so William McKinley, probably not that well known, kind of overshadowed by Teddy Roosevelt. His vice president, he's known for being assassinated, that sort of thing. What got me interested in him actually first was the Spanish, Cuban, American, Filipino War, doing research for the book that you just mentioned, Promise in Peril, America at the Dawn of a Global Age. And McKinley has this really important role in the U.S.'s first overseas war with a European power, with Spain, the first annexations that the U.S. has outside the continent. So you're going to be talking about that soon in your next shows, I'm sure. So that's really formative and important, and I think that got me interested. And then a second element, as I did more research on McKinley, that is a little bit more fine-grained, but I think listeners might be interested in, is that McKinley's kind of a transitional figure in the Republican Party. So I was doing a lot of research on people like Henry Cabot Lodge, a senator from Massachusetts, or Teddy Roosevelt, who we all know. They're like the younger guard of the Republican Party. McKinley's in this interesting position. He serves in the Civil War. He's a Republican of that stripe, but he's not one of the oldest ones either. He's not the old guard who are the abolitionist types of the 1840s, 1850s. So he's this transitional figure. In 1896, he's a little bit more out front on progressive things than even Teddy Roosevelt would have been. But by the time it's 1900 and at the very end of his life, 1901, when he's assassinated, he's actually a little bit behind those folks now, the new young Republicans who are coming up. And so as I studied those folks, I thought, wow, McKinley kind of is this transitional figure in the political thought, practice, policies of the Republican Party, sort of emblematic of this era. So I'm glad to be talking about it with you.
Awesome. Yeah, when I was reading his history, so much of what you said pops out, and it's been such a fun story to tell. Now, in particular, the selection of 1896, McKinley, he's really going to kind of transform American politics that year. But the foundation of that campaign seems to be laid many years earlier, when he becomes a friend of big business with his tariff policies, and when he befriends the political operative Mark Hanna. Let's start with the tariffs. What did he do, and why will this be important later?
Yeah, it's a good question. So tariffs are the most important political issue in the late 19th century. And if you're thinking about them much in the 21st century, if you're trying to teach, if you're doing research, they are often pretty boring. But that's what most of the political debates revolve around. You flip open the congressional record to almost any era in this period, any month, any day, and you'll find something relating to tariffs. Why? Well, there's sort of two issues there, and the Republicans are leaders in this, protectionist tariffs in this period. But the two main issues are, one, it's how the federal government raises revenue. It's a big part of that. You've got that and vice taxes, basically. That's it. And they're raising a bunch, as you know. So there's a surplus, more or less, in this period. So then Republicans, the second piece of that is, what are you going to do with the surplus, and what's the tariff intended to do? And that's the question for Republicans. It's actually a really important question for intellectuals in this period. The new sort of fields of the social sciences and economics are trying to make arguments for why protective tariffs might work. And this goes back, the main one that somebody like McKinley would have subscribed to goes all the way back to the beginning. Alexander Hamilton in the 1790s basically said, to nurture infant industries, you need to have high protective tariffs. And that's the key element that somebody like the Ohio industrialists like Hanna, but also McKinley buy into, why they're for protective tariffs. And it's a central argument for Democrats going the other direction. So in his first inaugural, I think it is, Grover Cleveland spends almost all his time talking about tariffs and wanting to reduce them. And, again, this seems pretty boring to the modern ear, but it's absolutely crucial if you think about how the government's funded, where your priorities are domestically. So what's the story? What gets McKinley on the scene? 1890, the so-called McKinley tariff is this big move. It raises tariffs all across the board. There's something like 450 amendments to the McKinley tariff. It creates the moniker for McKinley, the Napoleon of protection, or Little Napoleon. And he sort of seems to, the political, cartoons of the era have him striding around as this kind of colossus or mini colossus, if you're taking the Napoleon line, on holding the line on protective tariffs. So they eliminated, there was some elimination of tariffs in there, but mostly it was raising tariffs up in 1890. And the idea was that this would protect domestic industries. But there's a big issue in this moment, and maybe this is worth bringing out. We could talk about it more later. The American economy is changing. So it used to be that there was a lot more being imported than exported. But by the late 19th century, that's shifted. And so the US is exporting a hell of a lot. And so high protective tariffs, if they're reciprocated by other countries, are now becoming a problem. So if other countries match the tariff rates that the US has, on the same kinds of goods that the U.S. might be producing, that's a problem. And so this is what the core of the debates are about when you get down to the details in the 1880s and 1890s, which particular goods, especially raw materials, should have tariffs and more refined kinds of goods. Tin plates is one of them that gets debated all the time in this period. And how high should the tariffs be? Because that's a big thing that's being imported by American businesses. If you fast forward that, about a decade after the McKinley tariff, while he's still in office, the U.S. industries are finally making a lot of tin plates themselves. But it comes at a big cost to consumers. So that's the other piece of this puzzle. Who's going to pay the bill for this? And as we all know from the recent debates in just the last few years, when the Trump administration was imposing protective tariffs, it's consumers who pay. And in the 1870s, 1880s, and 1890s, with cyclic downturns, regular consumers are having a hard time making ends meet. So this Republican tariff policy looks a lot like protecting big business. So that also generates all the elements that you'd imagine for having people like Hanna and others in the camp of McKinley, helping support sort of this wave of protective tariff policies and politicians.
Let's dive in on who you just mentioned, Mark Hanna. Who was Mark Hanna, and why was he a big deal?
Yeah, so Mark Hanna is a really interesting figure. He becomes a prominent politician. Like so many of the folks you've been talking about the last few weeks, probably in episodes, Ohio politics dominate. And he's an Ohioan through and through. He's in there with a number of figures, Rutherford B. Hayes. He's trying to prop up the Ohio Republican Party and push it forward as the national sort of the determining factor for national Republican politics as well. So he's a businessman, born in Ohio, becomes friends with McKinley in about 1880. He takes over. He's in the coal business. He starts in the grocery business from his family. He takes over some banking. He winds up owning one of the major Cleveland newspapers. He's got a hand in all kinds of businesses and trusts. And eventually he becomes a senator in 1897. But he doesn't seem to have had much immediate interest. He never holds office in Ohio, for instance, much immediate interest in holding office, more wanting to have some power behind the throne, so to speak. And if you look at older political histories, or if you look at the political cartoons and some of the Democratic propaganda of this era, people like Hanna were held up as the sort of dollar men behind big business that was then behind politicians, like the kind of key figures of corruption in American politics. So if you think about the Gilded Age and Progressive era, right, this was what Mark Twain and Charles Warner wrote in 1873, the Gilded Age. It's all about corruption. And in the popular imagination of that period, that corruption took the form of people like a Hanna. I think his college classmate or high school classmate was, John Rockefeller. So like the connections are there all over the place. The robber barons, the big money interests, the people who are buying off folks. One interesting tidbit that historians have said about Hanna's relationship with McKinley is that early on, it was thought that Hanna dominated that. When we looked at the records, we didn't have as many papers to look at. But now historians are much more of the disposition that actually McKinley was more in charge of that relationship, and that McKinley kind of directed Hanna and knew what he wanted. And though McKinley didn't often express those things, and that's something interesting for us to talk about, he's been a little bit of an enigma in political history. It does seem much more clear that Hanna was not pulling the strings nearly as much as people intuited or arguments against special interests seem to suggest,
Man, I look forward to diving more into that. I'd love to hear about Hanna. What was he interested in? What were his wants? Why is he, starting to dabble into politics? What he wants to be the power behind the throne to do what?
Yeah, well, that's a kind of good question, and maybe a little unclear in some ways. I mean, certainly he's very invested in Republican politics. He very briefly served, doesn't see any combat in the Civil War. So unlike somebody like McKinley, who did, who left with the rank of major and was often called major by a lot of folks. That the Civil War experience was part of what generated his republicanism. He had a genuine hatred for Democrats. And this is something that's really common for those people who were kind of alive and kicking and involved in the politics of the Civil War period. So part of his belief, particularly in 1896 and why McKinley, is that Democrats, now led by a fusion with William Jennings Bryan, seem to be offering a very anti-big business, anti-large government, sort of perspective that, one, undercut his own self-interest, obviously, but also seemed to undercut the kind of longer-standing goals of the Republican Party. States' rights, you've seen the rise of Jim Crow. It's not like people like McKinley or Hanna were way out there as racial egalitarians, don't get me wrong, but they certainly still subscribed to some of the core principles of the Republican Party, and they knew that there was systematic disfranchisement in the American South. They knew that Bryan had locked up like 112 electoral votes because people who were eligible weren't allowed to vote, right? So that seemed fundamentally undemocratic. And you can find in the statements of people like Hanna a really firm belief that sort of the end of democracy was nigh if the Democrats keep winning elections, if people like Bryan can get their, sort of free silver plus states' rights passed and agrarians hold power.
So Mark Hanna is motivated by this beautiful marriage of what is right and just, and also what's good for his pocketbook. Yep. Which is just beautiful when that works out.
Totally. You might say that's a truism for like all American politics.
Right. Right. At what point did Mark Hanna start thinking this McKinley guy can become president? And what becomes his motive for really helping fuel that rise? And what draws them together?
Yeah, so McKinley serves in Congress a bunch of terms. The 1880s, he gets booted out in a wave of Democrats. He immediately becomes governor of Ohio. Right around then, so that's 1891. He's really establishing a relationship with somebody like Hanna and other funders in the Republican Party and in the Ohio sort of elite party politics circles. But the big thing that really transforms this moment, as we're thinking about the election of 1896 and Hanna's role in thinking, hey, McKinley can do it, is 1894. So we already got 1890. We got the McKinley tariff in there. We got 1893, which is this big panic, which sort of destroys the American economy and really changes party politics in this moment. We can get to that more. But so there's this big panic, big depression, second worst in U.S. history. The Great Depression is what we call, what was called in 1929, 1930 to differentiate it from 1893, although we tend not to think that way. But 1894 is this really important moment where it's the biggest transition in party politics in a midterm election in U.S. political history. So you get something like Democrats lose 113 seats. It's amazing. Republicans really take off, and political scientists often refer to this as part of a really broader, important realignment in party politics. And the kinds of people who are doing a lot of robust campaigning are like McKinley and like Teddy Roosevelt is sort of new out on the stump in that period. And McKinley does, I looked it up before we were coming on, he does on the order of 371 speeches across 16 states in 1890. So when you think about in 1896, he's going up against Bryan, who's out there stumping all over the place. McKinley has just done it. He's proven he can do so-called retail politics that way. He's actually a great orator. People don't give him much credit for that. He's good. He's a good speaker. He's good at obfuscating points too, being a little bit vague to not take too tough or of a stand. Good at calibrating for different audiences. And so people like him are why Republicans sweep so rapidly through the House. And then they begin this ascent, which is really multi-generational up until the Depression. You get the election of 1912, you get some Democrats coming in, but really Republicans start to dominate American politics again in this period. And it's coming out of 1894 that you see that.
Well, it's funny to talk about 1894 being that giant swing, because if I remember right, 4 years earlier, 1890 was like a giant swing the other way, where all the Republicans got kicked out. Yep. So they're just swinging all over the place back then.
Part of that's these cyclic recessions. That's a piece of it. The electorate is not happy with the federal government and its more modest sized role. I mean, we still see that today, but in that era, the federal government didn't have much control. It's not like it's Grover Cleveland's fault that there's a panic of 1893, for instance. Right. He's not even in office when it starts.
Yeah, the Fed doesn't exist yet. Like all these tools that at least now you can kind of point to and be like, hey, why don't you pull that lever? The lever doesn't exist yet.
Exactly right. Yeah. And then you also see these debates over civil service reform, which I know you've talked about on different podcasts, but it's like, hey, the people are turning over their partisan hacks. And so part of the shift then in the late 1890s is towards more of that civil service reform, more robust federal government. And getting back to that earlier point, it's about these young Republicans who want to see that. They're not as happy with the shift since the 1880s towards big business and towards sort of partisanship in the Republican Party. Now they're still, aided and significantly by people like Hanna, right, and big industrialists who turn out a ton of money for this campaign in 1896. Nevertheless, they've got a little bit more trust busting in them and a little bit more thinking that we need a meritocratic civil service to run things. We need a more robust federal government to smooth out economic downturns and that sort of thing.
So what are going to be the big issues in 1896? You've mentioned a little bit of history, like 1890, there was a big party swing one way, 1893, a huge depression, 1894, a huge swing the other way. So in 1896, what are the issues that everybody's talking about?
Well, I'll tick off a few. We could dive in if you want. Right. Okay. So obviously the tariff, right? So the big campaign promises by McKinley, tariff. And the opposite coming from the Bryan camp. We need less of that. We need more free silver. So currency is the other big issue. With free silver, get off, have bimetallism. This is very popular. We could talk more about that, but this is very popular in the West and amongst agrarians. This question with the economy still suffering, how do you aid working men, particularly yeoman farmers, people who have a lot of debt? So they want to inflate the currency. They want a lot more currency out there, and that'll make their debt less effectively, even if it also inflates prices, right? But of course, that hurts businesses. That hurts banks. You inflate the currency, right? That's a big piece of it. The currency, we could talk about that, right? The Cross of Gold speech and Bryan, he's really charismatic on this, and it's very appealing. And that's also animating people like Hanna to not like that position, both for their pocketbooks and out of principle. Then there's also race. This is the era, right? The rise of Jim Crow. We've got now beginning to have widespread lynchings. I think by some counts in 1898, you had the highest per capita number of lynchings in the US. That's becoming more obvious. The Republican Party is against that. Obviously, they speak to that, but they're fairly wishy-washy on taking a strong stand because, of course, that would require something like federal troops or federal oversight, particularly in the South. But there are also lynchings going on in border states in the North. So race, tariff, currency, those are all big ones. Let's see. Labor, another enormous issue in this era, right? So 1894 also has the Pullman strikes. This is where Eugene Debs, the 5-time candidate for president for the Socialist Party, starts really making his stand. He's the head of the American Railway Union. So you've got lots of strikes happening in this period. Roiling strikes, they're being put down by groups like the Pinkertons. So there's actual violence out there. There's anarchists are dashing around. In fact, the anarchist who kills, American-born anarchist who kills McKinley in this era is of that sort of stripe. So how labor relations will be dealt with, what the Republican Party's position will be in navigating kind of between the Scylla and Charybdis of labor and working men on the one hand, and big business and industry that they're trying to support on the other. And their usual argument is something like full employment will solve all problems, that plus trickle down, which sounds a little bit familiar to modern ears, probably. Another piece of the puzzle, civil service reform. It's been sort of going on back and forth, 1870s, 1880s. McKinley kind of shoots for a middle ground there. He rolls back some positions that Cleveland had allowed to become ones that were for political appointees. So there's a variety of these things in that era. Those are some of the big ones. I think the big irony of this moment, if we're going to the 30,000-foot view on the election, is when he comes into office, one of the first things that Cleveland says to McKinley is, watch out, war is on the horizon, either with Venezuela, regarding the boundaries of Venezuela with Great Britain, which is a huge thing, and protecting Republican democratic rights in the hemisphere, which the U.S. had pledged itself to do since the Monroe Doctrine in 1823. And of course, with Cuba, the roiling rebellion, insurrection on the island of Cuba, humanitarian atrocities going on there. But McKinley, the whole campaign is on domestic issues by and large. So as with so many presidencies and so many campaigns, the thing that the president thinks they'll get to focus on, the administration they even build to do that, often winds up deviating entirely based on different circumstances.
Totally great point. So it sounds like there's 5 issues that he's campaigning on. None of them are foreign policy, but he's got tariffs, and at the moment he's high tariffs. Yep. He's got currency at the moment. He's gold standard. And then I think you mentioned labor, race. Yep. I'm already blanking on the 5th one.
And civil service.
So civil service. Pro-reform. I mean, everybody's pro-reform right then, right? It's
for middle ground reform. So he wants to get rid of the folks that Cleveland put in and then do some reform, right?
Got it. And then labor. What did you say his solution on labor was? What's his position on what to do about the inequality there?
So labor's interesting. So one of the things you get is that he winds up, one way that he appeases labor is he puts in Terence Powderly, who is a former head of the Knights of Labor. He puts him in as a commissioner of immigration. And one of the positions of the Republican Party in this period, which is rather ignominious, but it's shared by lots of people on what you'd call the political left, like labor activists, is to limit immigration. So he's for limiting immigration to attempt to generate conditions for higher wages for labor. On the other hand, he's against kind of xenophobia and nativism. He takes a few actually pretty principled and strong stands in the state of Ohio as nativism was rising in the early 1890s. Again, he's the Republican Party of the 1890s and early 1900s is really trapped between, sort of a kind of egalitarian set of principles that they inherit from the abolitionists. Yeah. So, to treat people fairly, all men created equal. And then there's a kind of set of principles that are protectionist, so somewhat insular, but pro big business, and aligned for the larger conglomerations of people and groups like, corporations against individuals, sort of right to contract sort of thing. So he skirts this middle line, but he appeases labor a bit there. And then frankly, I guess I would say as a historian of this period, his get out of jail free card is war. And so once the U.S. goes to war in 1898, patriotism kind of dominates, and the regular American working man, as in so many eras, and I don't mean this pejoratively at all, regular American citizen tends to rally around the flag, and that's what you get. So labor folks are pretty happy, more or less, and the economy is booming. But by the time he's elected, the headline on his second election in 1900, many of the headlines say "Champion of Progress, William McKinley," "Champion of Prosperity, William McKinley."
Did he have? You said one of those 5 issues was race relations. Did he have a platform on what to do about the South?
Yeah, so it's interesting. The Republican Party platform is about bringing the South and the North together and saying that the old tensions and conflict are gone. It's the uniting of gray and blue, and you see this in some of the campaign pins and other elements. And he's pretty. He's pretty risk averse, frankly. He's very terse in what he has to say and measured, and does not go out on a limb. And if you want to cast blame from a modern sensibility, there are plenty of folks who are taking much stronger stands on questions of racial injustice in the American South, for instance, in this era, and even within the Republican Party, and he's not one of them. And that's one of the other divides with those younger Republicans I was talking about. So some of them are very, say, for immigration restriction, but also for rights for African Americans. So there's a lot of there's a lot of complexities to Republican Party politics then, but that's a key one. So they argue, lynching, it says something like there should be no lynching in America, and we're bringing the North and South together, and the South can govern itself, right? Like these are mutually contradictory in this era, and yet that's what they say. In part because this is crass politics 101. McKinley, Hanna, those folks, they want to peel off a couple Southern states.
Yeah.
They don't in 1896, but they actually start to get closer than you might imagine. And in 1900, it's an even bigger win for McKinley, and they're peeling off some more folks. Again, that's more war related, in my opinion.
Yeah. Okay. So we talked all about McKinley, the issues, his positions on him. I'd love to talk about his opponent, William Jennings Bryan. You brought him up a couple times before. The super charismatic guy. He often gets a lot of praise as one of the greatest orators in U.S. history, and he is nothing like what the Democratic Party was before him. Also, I think if I remember right, Cleveland even like silently is like, I hope McKinley beats this next Democrat.
Yeah, well, so quickly while we're doing gold stuff again, when the economy's tanking, Cleveland comes out for the gold standard because his thinking is that will mollify big business, and the psychology of the market is very well known at that point. But that doesn't help. So, but if you think about that quick contrast, when you get Bryan in, free silver, it's currency being one of the top issues of the day. Of course, Cleveland is not enthusiastic, at least on those grounds in that moment. So Bryan is an amazing figure. There's a fantastic book if people are interested by Michael Kazin, A Godly Hero. Really, I think the best book on Bryan, on his politics, on religion, on his views on the economy, all kinds of stuff. But in any case, so Bryan's about 36 in 1896.
He's barely eligible to run.
Yeah. Whereas McKinley seems old in comparison, was only about 53. Mm-hmm. So, that's and McKinley, as I said, had been doing a lot of speaking. He was known as a good orator. It's unfair to say that it's a total, clash of contrasting styles, although the campaign is very different. But Bryan, his main positions are coming from the populist left. So this is a fusion party moment in 1896 where the populists support the Democratic nominee. The Democratic nominee is also the Populist Party's nominee. And as a fusion campaign, it's a really important one in American politics. There's very few moments where we've had third and fourth parties that were viable. This 1880s into 1890s, the sort of Omaha platform of 1892, the rise of populists is a really powerful force in the American South and especially West and parts of the Midwest. This is their moment to shine, and Bryan's their candidate. The problem is the Democratic Party is riven by the sort of silverites and gold folks. They don't necessarily like everything about the populists either. And then the Republican Party also has silverites in it in the West and Upper Midwest, though not as many. It's not as riven. Anyway, so Bryan's a fascinating figure, amazing speaker. One of the things that historians say about his barnstorming in that era was that it actually undercut him. That in some ways his capacity to go out and do so much speaking made him seem like a bit in that era a kind of fly by night, not as serious. Now later in his career, he becomes Secretary of State. He runs for president the next time as well in 1900. He's definitely seen as a kind of establishment politician with a lot of experience. But in 1896, he's a newcomer. He's an outsider. He's a great speaker. But is it fluff? Is the question. And that's certainly what Hanna messages in an amazing amount, millions of pamphlets and newspaper ads thrown out against him and speakers. And that's really the contrast that you see with McKinley. McKinley runs a so-called front porch campaign, but not like the old ones. This wasn't your question, but I know we're going to talk about it. So,
we will talk about it. Yeah, let's go. Yeah. Sure.
Yeah. So, but I'll stick to Bryan just for a little bit longer. Right. So he's for free coinage of silver, 16-1, 15-1. So these are the ratios that are being debated in this era. The problem was, what would the federal government, how would the federal government buy this silver, and would it be coined? If that's clear enough. I don't know if we've dealt with this in other podcasts. It's a whole nother long jag to get into currency issues. But the sort of cross of gold and the crown of thorns elements aren't just about that. They're about corruption. They're about the role of big business in American life. In this era, people talked a lot about the tramp follows the train, that poverty and progress were going hand in hand, and that the challenge in American society in an industrializing, modernizing world, and here a data point is really useful. In 1880, the U.S. is majority rural. In 1920, the U.S. is majority urban. People living in the 1890s see this happening around them. They see themselves being immiserated by moving to the cities, having wage work, being unemployed cyclically whenever the industries, crumbled, or through speculation, quickly losing their money. And in fact, the 1893 panic, McKinley loses almost all his money. If it weren't for Hannah, he might have been destitute. And so, people are seeing this. And so Bryan's campaign isn't just on something like Cross of Gold, which sounds great and fascinating and interesting, but it really goes back to sort of biblical principles. And that's, you see this much further. He's in the Scopes trial, as you probably know, and you'll get to, he's the prosecutor there. And he believes in these kind of biblical core principles about the working man's rights, that every human being has, dignity, and that modern corporations and industry were depriving them of that. So it's a really strong kind of a message. It's not the kind of message that Grover Cleveland put out there, right? Even though he was a reform leader and had some really sort of labor-oriented beliefs in some ways, nowhere near what Bryan put out there. So anti-corruption, anti-big business, for the working man, for farmers, and he even says things that pit the urban and rural against each other. And this is in the Cross of Gold speech, he says something like, burn down your cities, but as long as the farms survive, the cities will grow back. But burn down the farms and there'll never be cities.
That sounds very Thomas Jefferson.
Yeah, right.
How kind of modern progressive is he? And what I mean by that is I always hear the talk of, he's pro bimetallism, pro some of these other things we're talking about, anti-tariff. The Progressive Party, if I remember right, they also believed in things like 8-hour workdays, or at least limited workdays. He's supported, if I remember right, by Eugene Debs, who there's not a socialist party yet. There's going to be next election, but right now Debs is like, support Bryan. Is Bryan supporting these other things, these social safety nets, or is that not an idea that exists yet?
That's an interesting question. He is supporting social safety nets in the sense, well, let me pull that back.
Sure.
You're right to ask this question. So the problem for the Democratic Party or the Populist Party in this moment is that some believe in a stronger federal or state government to do that kind of work, and others do not. And so if you think about why the Democratic Party has locked up these 100 plus electoral votes in the South, it's because the states can do what they want. Part of that is disenfranchising people of color and privileging white people, and men in particular, white men. But part of that is also enacting different kinds of policies in different areas, including, local progressive reform, things that are popular, like prohibition, for instance, in some states, and unpopular in others. So they've got a tricky sort of row to hoe there. And what you see out of Bryan in 1900 or in 1896 is a little different from 1900. And historians often argue that he got exposed on the campaign because he had to come up with different kinds of answers to these questions. So you do see him for making some cases for minimum wages, for instance, for limiting hours, total numbers of hours. But you don't see the kind of argument for a strong federal government that you get by 1900 from the Republican Party platform, and by 1904, with coming out of the Mueller v. Oregon case and other things at the Supreme Court level, you actually have real pushback against terrible working conditions. So he's for better working conditions, but he's not operationalizing how that will happen exactly. So that's therein lies the rub, and that's the problem for Democratic Party politics in this era, because a strong federal government is something they can't possibly condone, and a weak federal government is what they're for, except for certain cases. And that's why also Bryan is a bit of an outlier from somebody like Cleveland, because he's farther along that path for a stronger federal government. So you see like these terrible quotes from Cleveland in 1894. We're not going to help the working man, right? This panic is not the government. You have to support the. I mean, this is a bad paraphrase, but he says something like the working man should passionately support the government, and the government will not support the working man.
Right. Yeah. The government doesn't exist to support the people exist to support the government. Something very much like that. Yeah. Just very like, whoa. Okay.
Whereas Bryan would very much say the opposite, right? Yeah. That the government needs to support the people, the people's inherent dignity, et cetera, through policies like, free coinage of silver, bimetallism, restrictions on trusts. But then what are the next steps? And you don't fully get there. And you definitely don't, where you especially don't get there. And I don't know how much you focused on this in other podcasts, where you really don't get there is in the party platforms. So the Democratic Party platform has a hard time on fusion in this moment. What does that mean to bring effectively populist positions into this party that doesn't see quite eye to eye with the Populist Party? And the Republican Party, for that matter, I mean, I actually pulled it up for this as we think about McKinley. Their platform, says for the first time since the Civil War, we've seen the American people witnessing the calamitous consequences of full and unrestricted democratic control of the government. And then they say, we're pledging ourselves to high protective tariffs because that'll solve all the problems.
Totally. It's nice when you have a simple solution like that.
For sure.
So McKinley, certainly more the big business guy. Bryan starting to freak big business out with some of these new ideas. Even if they're not 100% thought out, they're thought out enough to be scary. And this is going to help McKinley raise just gobsmacking amounts of money. Can you tell me more about that? How does he turn the differences in their opinion into just a huge money advantage?
Yeah, well, the first is the most obvious that we've already covered. I mean, Bryan is a threat to big business, bottom line. So they're going to support any other candidate. And as most political historians note in this period, it just felt like a Republican victory, believe it or not. So Bryan, very charismatic, people like him. There's a real chance that Democrats could win. This fusion party thing is happening. But when you get through the panic, you get through the midterms, 1893, 1894, suddenly it's, even though Bryan is a very good candidate, a moderate Republican who's very measured, like McKinley ticks all the boxes, is a perfect kind of person to appease, especially Eastern big business folks, from banks and industry, heavy industry as well as light industry, which is an important distinction. When you get to 1898, for instance, banks don't like the uncertainty. Big banks, big industry don't like the uncertainty of what's going on in Cuba, but the smaller industries, light industry, the ones that aren't producing, say, big machinery, for instance, they don't care much about war, for instance. So special interests have different kinds of views about different sorts of crises, you might say. But it's very clear that Bryan represents a crisis to the big banks. So how does he operationalize it? This is where Hanna becomes a genius. So Hanna was a big political leader, 1880s, 1890s, Ohio Republican Party. He's there as a force behind some of the other Ohio presidents. But now putting his muscle behind McKinley, he's brilliant on this front porch campaign style. He's brilliant on pamphlets and leaflets and having speakers go out. He's brilliant on, just inundating newspapers across the country with McKinley messages. Every time McKinley gives a speech on his front porch, some version of that goes to the press within 24 hours. So remember, he's also a journalist. He owns this newspaper. Like, he gets it. He gets it in fundamentally new ways. And this is the era of the penny press and yellow journalism, right? This is the era. This is really the rise of that. And Hanna's got his finger on the pulse of it. And part of that is getting the right message out to the right elites. And he literally taxes different businesses. So he pretty much says, he goes to people and he says, you have to effectively tithe to this campaign. Remember, contributions weren't being policed then like they have been in the late 20th century. So you see a huge flow of money coming in. You see Hanna really twisting arms and saying, look, if Bryan wins, you're clearly going to lose. You've already had these problems. He gives them copies of particular speeches that McKinley's made that will appeal to them. And he's just a juggernaut of, he's one of the very first, maybe arguably the best bundler in 19th century political history, in the least corrupt sense of the word. And I know there's been a lot of corruption in the politics you've handled. So yeah. Thus far. So he makes businesses, he taxes them effectively from the convention onward, and he gives them what they want in terms of McKinley's words. And that's a big part of this successful campaign.
And I'm curious, is he just going after big businesses? What's the divide, say, between big businesses and small businesses? If you're like a mom and pop, shop trying to get by, does he not care about you? You're going to get buried by this? Is he just going to the Rockefellers and, the so forth?
Yeah. So it starts at the top, but this is also the era of the rise of modern philanthropy and modern thinking about philanthropy, actually, this era into the early 20th century. So obviously, a lot of these robber barons are also philanthropists.
Yes.
Big dollar amounts.
Yeah.
But the other piece of that puzzle is what becomes the model known as the March of Dimes model, just getting 5 cents, 10 cents from regular people. Yeah. So if you look at letters in this era, you look at party contributions, you see lots of 10-cent kind of things. You don't just see these big checks.
Yeah.
And so in one data point that helps illuminate that is, so the front porch campaign sounds like McKinley's just hanging out on his front porch.
Yeah.
That is not true. They have a machine there. So something like 46 troops escort the people who want to come visit him on his front porch in Canton, Ohio. They bring them. They bring them from the rail station. They get a report ahead of time who's coming. He's able to say who's missing from their families there. He's doing his homework. He's calibrating his message to the delegates who are coming. Some of those individuals are giving small donations when they arrive, supporting the party, Republican Party, or supporting the campaign itself. So there's that piece of the puzzle there. So it's big and it's small, and all these people are coming through. Estimates are 700 or 800,000 Americans came through just that front porch, just over the course of the campaign. So spring, summer, fall, 1896. That's a remarkable number of folks, and they're coming from reports are, I haven't corroborated this in my own research, but virtually every state. So you have lots of people who love McKinley, love the Republican Party, are coming, giving their, 10 cents, as well as the big ones who are, the ones we're all a little bit suspicious of. And they absolutely were in the Gilded Age of Progressive era, right? The big money trusts. But so he's getting it from all of those areas, and they're able to then say, the working Republican from Massachusetts supports McKinley. He's giving,
it's always important.
10 cents a month. Oh yeah, absolutely. Even if, his does not have the ear of Hannah or those others. But that is also emblematic of the kind of support the Republican Party had and why they go off to such a resounding victory in this election.
So what does McKinley do with all that money? You mentioned all these printouts earlier, the newsletter. Like, is that what it is? Is there anything new that hadn't been done before that he's like, whoa, I have a lot of money. Let's have fun with this.
That's a good question. Well, the main things are what I said in terms of calibrating the message. I mean, historian Lewis Gould has said that this is the first modern campaign. That may be overstepping, it may not, but it has all the hallmarks of a modern campaign. A huge war chest, right? A strategy targeted to different populations who are coming through, right? Those delegations, knowing them well. Once McKinley gets into office, you see some very similar things happening. So how he uses the money in 1896 is similar to how he uses the office of the presidency in 1897. That is, he's great with journalists. He invites them in. In the White House, he sets up an area where journalists for the first time can camp out, hang out on the second floor. So he's good with journalists. He's good at getting the message out. The Hannah vision is to print, to overwhelm the country with images. They're great on political cartoons. So there's one that there's a couple that I've pulled up, but one that I've here right now. It's a caricature of the Democratic campaign headquarters, and this perfectly encapsulates some of the messages we've already been talking about. On the Democratic campaign headquarters, it says things like, vote for free silver and be prosperous like us in Japan or Mexico or China or South America or India or Guatemala. Those are literally all the kinds of things with very caricatured racist images of the people in those places.
God, I bet.
Yes. But the idea there is that he's getting out that message to people who may be semi-literate as well, right? All they need to see there is these images in the Democratic campaign headquarters. So it's hitting every sort of demographic way before the thinking about that. And then in 1897, similar things, McKinley looks hard at what is possible to know in that era before modern professional polling. So he cares about public opinion. And that's why you see there's this slightly, let's call it, compromise stance on the gold standard, both in the party platform and where he's headed, which says, hey, we will allow bimetallism and some coinage of silver if by international agreement, we can work that out with other countries. And as soon as McKinley's in office and that, doesn't matter as much, and people maybe don't have their eye on the ball that as much, that disappears.
Totally.
So by 1900, the U.S. is on the gold standard for sure. But how do they use the money? 2 million or more pamphlets are sent out. It's an enormous number. They've got a lot of journalists in their pocket. Remember, this is the partisan press then too. Yeah. So they've got a lot of journalists writing puff pieces. They've actually got organs of real newspapers in their pocket, Republican Party newspapers. So they're getting the message to those folks, and then they're generating new versions of those messages out to their audiences. It's a really kind of seamless public relations, public communication strategy. And that transcends and moves into the administration. And that's why it's right to think of it as kind of at least having all the hallmarks of a modern campaign and the modern presidency.
All right, I got a hypothetical for you next. And that is, McKinley, he had like 7 times as much money as William Jennings Bryan. If it had been even, if they had been operating on the same budget, who do you think wins that 1896 election? Is it still McKinley?
It's a good question. Historians like to shy away from counterfactuals.
I know, but we'd love to ask y'all.
Yeah, but it's fun too. I think Bryan had a kind of firewall that he was working against. I think he certainly could have won more total votes. And this might have been much more of a squeaker, like some of the previous elections that you've been working through on the podcast. It strikes me that this was a year for Republicans because of the economic downturn in 1893, the signal sent by the midterm elections. Not every time a midterm election shifts do parties shift, but they very often do. That's a good marker in U.S. political history. So I think this could have been a lot tighter without the campaign war chest, maybe without the genius of Hannah's strategy too. But I suspect this was a year for Republicans. I suppose the other counterfactual would be, what if they'd run somebody different? What if they'd run a Blaine who would have divided the Republican Party? What if they could have run a young Teddy Roosevelt? He wasn't, nobody was thinking that way then. Yeah. That would be interesting. I'm not sure. Or what if they'd run one of the old abolitionists? There's a guy, George Frisbee Hoar, the senior senator from Massachusetts. What would that have meant? What if he'd taken a stronger stance on anti-lynching or race in the South?
Right.
There's a lot of interesting counterfactuals there. And I'll give you one more. It's probably for a future podcast. Yeah. The big question of the McKinley presidency is, what if he had another term?
Sure.
And what he's signaling in 1900 is he's going to be tougher on big business. One of the last speeches he gives before he's assassinated is, I want to revisit the antitrust laws. So some of this stuff we're seeing in 1896, maybe after there's all the prosperity that comes and after the war, perhaps he was a more flexible thinker, more likely to shift towards a progressive mindset or a different set of agenda items than we can possibly give him credit for. It's a little like what would have happened with JFK.
Yeah, that always a great counterfactual. What if someone had lived?
Yeah, right.
What is the lasting legacy of McKinley's 1896 campaign?
Well, so a few things, and his presidency. I really want to lump that in there.
Yeah, put them together. Sure.
So you've got here I'll paint a picture. March 1897. His first inaugural. It's the first inaugural that's captured by Edison's kinetoscope. It's the first one you can see. All right, it's the first one that's being reported by telegraph and immediate sort of telephone communications. You're getting real information, real images from that day. 40,000 people show up. It's a sunny day. It's the first time that the president is ensconced in a plastic box. It's a glass then, but it marks a real change of eras. The presidency of McKinley, and the transformation of U.S. foreign policy and domestic politics. And the campaign, I think, is emblematic of that. So, having a modern kind of bundler, political genius, a Karl Rove type, if you will, with Hannah. And I can't stop myself from saying, McKinley offered Hannah a spot in his cabinet. And Hannah said something to the effect of, "Oh, that'll just confirm everybody's suspicions about me. We can't do that. I'm better off outside." And then when he appoints Sherman, then Hannah takes a Senate position in 1897. But that seems actually to me the height of genius. He got an even higher office. But in any case, what are the main takeaways? Look, newspaper campaigning, modern bundling, this front porch campaign that is not the antiquated kind, but a really kind of targeted approach to that has a streamlined, consistent message, but also can alter it enough You have a relationship with the press that he builds throughout his presidency. Once he's in office, he moves around a lot. He travels a lot. He's more like Bryan, giving speeches all over the place. So he's in touch with the people. He takes compromise measures on a number of topics, as we talked about. It's labor, it's civil service, it's race. He's not easily pinned down as extreme, and that's really, if you look at any presidential campaign in the 20th century, one of the things that we always talk about is tacking to the middle, right? And this is exactly what McKinley's doing. It's partly why he's so successful, because Bryan can't tack it. There's no middle for Bryan.
Right.
It's not possible. So I think, what you see in this moment is the rise of the modern presidency in all of its, sort of robust glory and all of the perils that come with it. So the other piece of that is, he's a micromanager. In the war in 1898, he's listening hourly to what's going on. Yeah. He really cares about these communications. He will take his pen to things that are going out, after those front porch rallies and conversations. So, and that is part of the rise of the imperial presidency, which we tend to think of as a piece of Teddy Roosevelt's legacy. But you might say that the foundation here is McKinley. Modern presidency, imperial presidency, a kind of, as political scientists say, a campaign that is now president-centered, not party-centered.
Yeah.
So if you go back to previous eras, like, who are the Democrats going to choose? Well, they got a solid South, but they're going to have a hard time in the U.S. in the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s. Now it's, Bryan and McKinley. There is the Democratic Party, but that's a fusion one. There's populists there, and the Republicans are trying to peel off folks. So this is a new change, sort of individual presidency-centered political campaigning. It's not like the parties don't matter a hell of a lot, because they do, but McKinley, it personifies a kind of presidency and presidential sort of character that I think we then see progressively in different kinds of presidencies moving forward.
That's an awesome call out of that point there. Last question I got for you. What lessons in leadership do you think we could learn from how McKinley ran his campaign?
That's a good one. So one thing that's interesting about the history of McKinley is people have had very dramatically different takes on him. What kind of leader he was he manipulated by Hannah, or did he manipulate Hannah, as we now tend to think? Did he have core positions or not? Teddy Roosevelt famously says something like he has no backbone, that McKinley has no backbone. Others think that he was really way too decisive, but behind closed doors. So you see a lot of competing interpretations. And I think one kind of leadership lesson you might take from that is that McKinley was a pretty good listener. He was a little bit of a cipher at times. So he was good at giving people what they wanted. So that's like 101 of retail politics, but also getting a sense of what the sort of zeitgeist was, or getting a litmus test of what constituencies wanted or what was going on in a given moment. That's really important in leadership. I mean, we all need to learn to, be quiet and listen more. That's a good principle. I think another stance here was, though he had some ebbs and flows in this moment, anti-corruption is a big part of American politics, and he's a pretty principled guy. Now, granted, there's this role of special interest in the campaign and everything we've been talking about. There's a low level of corruption across American politics. But you might argue that we've now created a new baseline in American politics by the 1890s, and it's not as fundamentally corrupt. And so his core principles do dictate the kinds of outcomes that he seeks to as a politician. He's not as compromise oriented as some other folks have been. That's a little bit. So what about other lessons? I think in the campaign itself, one lesson is to find a good friend who hopefully has deep pockets and good allies, right?
That's true. Every time I read a presidential biography, it seems like they have a friend who had a lot of money.
That's got to be part of it. Networks and connections, for sure. You can cultivate them. You don't have to have them growing up, but you need to find them to be an effective presidential candidate. And, related to that, I would say cultivate the press. Right. So one of the things that he's really smart at is getting to know, journalists and allying with them, or at least recognizing that it's very important to not have an adversarial relationship with the press. And that translates to the White House. And you get the first modern press briefings basically in the McKinley White House. That hadn't happened to this point. So, cultivate the press, have good friends, listen more than you talk, or at least listen before you speak. And then sort of have the courage of your convictions seems to be part of it. Although I would say, that's definitely a triangulation if you're a president, right? You rarely find presidents or leading political officials who can fully articulate their principles because, they'll alienate somebody, right? And
right.
In the 1890s, the Republican Party, as I said, it's really has a tremendously hard time dealing with the fact that the American South is fundamentally undemocratic and racist and is killing Americans. And, short of starting another civil war, what are the options? What are the available options? And you'll see this with Teddy Roosevelt. You'll see this with Taft. I mean, they're hamstrung.
Yeah. Well, that's a depressing note to end on, but that's all my questions I had. Thank you so much for joining me. If you'd like to hear more from Chris, please check out Promise in Peril, America in the Dawn of a Global Age, and give him a follow on Twitter at CMCK Nichols, Nichols spelled Nichols. Thank you for your time, Chris.
Hey, thanks so much, Kenny. Great to be on with you.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of Abridged Presidential Histories. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe, tell your friends about the show, and leave a 5-star review on your podcast listening platform of choice. It's always so great to hear from you guys. Makes my day. You can also follow the show on Facebook at Abridged Presidential Histories or on Twitter at APH Podcast. If you would like to support the show, you can look it up on Patreon or go directly to www.patreon.com/Abridged Presidential Histories. It helps me buy books and pay to host the show. And thank you everyone who's contributed so far. The music in today's podcast is a public domain recording of the United States Army Old Guard Fife and Drum Corps. In our next episode, we will look into the international adventures of William McKinley, the annexation of Hawaii, the Spanish-American War, the Philippine-American War, and the Boxer Rebellion in China. The U.S. is about to go imperial in a big, big way. That's next time on Abridged Presidential Histories.